Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. I've got a short review for you today. I'm looking at the ASUS ROG Strix XG32UCWG. A couple of months ago, I looked at the XG32UCWMG, which is a 32-inch 4K WOLED gaming monitor with a true black glossy coating and 240Hz maximum refresh rate. Well, the XG32UCWG is, on the spec sheet, basically the same product, but with a reduced 165Hz refresh rate. Both models support dual mode. The UCWG variant I'm looking at today goes up to 330Hz at 1080p, while the UCWMG offers 480Hz. The main reason you'd get the UCWG instead of the UCWMG is its lower price tag. ASUS told me a couple of months ago that the global MSRP for this 165Hz monitor is $800 US, while the 240Hz variant is $950 US. That's about a 15% saving, so not too bad. Here in Australia, we're looking at $1,660 for the 165Hz model and $2,000 for the 240Hz model, so a similar sort of percentage difference. The reason why I've tested the UCWG as well as the UCWMG is to confirm that both models offer the same performance outside of the refresh rate difference. Occasionally we see two products that appear mostly identical on the surface with only one major specification difference, only to test them and find out some other aspects have been cut back on one of the models, like brightness, port selection, or calibration. Testing them allows us to fully confirm how similar they are and potentially proceed with a recommendation knowing we've actually got the data on hand to do so. I'll cut to the chase. Based on my testing, the XG32UCWG is basically the same monitor as the XG32UCWMG in all areas of performance except for the refresh rate. If you want to know in detail how this display performs, our thoughts on the design, features, and so on, go back and check out our comprehensive review of the UCWMG because the vast majority of what I said there also applies to the UCWG. As far as I can tell, the 165Hz and 240Hz models use the exact same hardware, including a virtually identical WOLED panel, with the variant used in this monitor being downclocked or binned to 165Hz. The design of both models is exactly the same. They have the same features, including the Neo proximity sensor, anti-flicker setting, ELMB black frame insertion, and KVM switch. The screen coating is identical, same deployment of true black glossy that we loved on the 240Hz version, and the port selection is also unchanged. The UCWMG already used DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, so there was no need to cut back on that port to save money, as we've occasionally seen with some brands that use DP 2.1 on their flagship monitor and DP 1.4 on the cut-down model. Throughout this review, we're using B-roll that we already captured for the UCWMG review because, again, the two monitors are physically identical. This makes it very difficult to tell the products apart if you ever run into that situation, and also, the name is very close. It's pretty easy to confuse XG32UCWG with XG32UCWMG. The addition of the M means 240Hz refresh rate, so make sure you look closely and don't accidentally buy the wrong one. Performance results are the same in areas like brightness. For example, my sample of the 165Hz variant produced 251 nits peak in the SDR mode. The 240Hz variant hit 244 nits, so just a 3% difference. They're not nerfing brightness with the cheaper model. Same color gamut as well, 72.3% Rec 2020 on this model, 72.4% on the 240Hz model. The 165Hz UCWG variant was a little better calibrated in the SDR mode than my 240Hz UCWMG unit in both the default out-of-the-box configuration and also in the sRGB mode. This could be because I'm testing the 165Hz model with a newer MCM103 firmware, whereas the UCWMG results are from the product's launch with MCM101 firmware. Based on these results, though, I would expect both models to offer similar SDR calibration, accounting for unit variance, and I was super impressed with how well calibrated the UCWG is. In the HDR mode, the UCWG variant performs better, and I suspect this is again due to firmware updates and tweaks. When I originally reviewed the UCWMG, I noted that the best HDR configuration, console mode plus brightness set to 100, had a bit of over-brightening occurring in certain situations. That's been dialed back a bit with the UCWG running firmware MCM103, so there's a better balance of performance across a range of HDR scenes. The good thing to confirm here though is that the 165Hz variant does not perform worse. At the very least, I would expect it to deliver the same experience as the 240Hz model. Same goes for brightness results, noting there have been some improvements to HDR accuracy. My UC WG unit was actually slightly brighter on average, though things like 2% window tests and full screen brightness are much of a muchness. There's no sneaky downgrading here though, it's the same WOLED HDR experience with the same ASUS features. The main area that's different is motion performance due to the difference in maximum refresh rate, but this is not something that affects response time performance. This WOLED panel is just as fast transitioning at 165Hz as it is at 240Hz, which is one of the brilliant things about this technology for variable refresh gamers. What you need to keep in mind when buying an OLED, especially one with a lower refresh rate, is that clarity on these panels is directly tied to refresh rate. At the same refresh rate, two different OLED monitors will look basically the same, so the actual refresh rate you'll be using is more important than the maximum refresh rate of the monitor. If you compare two OLEDs, one with the 240Hz max refresh and one with the 165Hz max refresh, but both are playing games at 120 FPS with the 120Hz refresh rate, they will look the same and give the same experience. Where higher refresh rate OLEDs become of benefit is when you use the highest refresh rate capabilities. Running an OLED at 240Hz produces a clearer image than at 165Hz with better smoothness and responsiveness. This is the key benefit the more expensive UC WMG variant provides. This has advantages when gaming at high frame rates, for example multiplayer games or games with frame generation enabled. But a higher refresh OLED only has an advantage when you exceed the refresh rate of a lower refresh model. If you are planning to play games at refresh rates below 165Hz, there is no benefit to purchasing a 240Hz model. This raises the question of whether it's worth spending more to get the 240Hz model or saving money to get the 165Hz model. The 240Hz model definitely has better motion clarity comparing highest versus highest refresh rate, and that will come in handy when using the screen for fast-paced games. You might not think of 4K as a typical multiplayer game resolution, but if you have high-end hardware and that's your preferred type of game, the 240Hz model is the better choice. It also has greater headroom for future PC hardware upgrades if you like targeting higher and higher frame rates over time. The other advantage to 240Hz is if you'd like to use frame generation. On a 165Hz monitor with single frame generation, the maximum real frame rate you will achieve without exceeding the monitor's maximum refresh is only 82 FPS. So with frame generation on, you'll max out with the latency experience of around 80 FPS gaming. But on a 240Hz monitor, that maximum real frame rate rises to 120 FPS and the latency experience improves with it. The final advantage to the higher refresh rate is lower input latency when gaming at the highest refresh. 165Hz has more refresh lag than 240Hz, even though the processing delay is the same, which is why 240Hz monitors feel faster to use in addition to better smoothness. Again, this is mostly an advantage for competitive games, but the desktop also feels nicer to use on a higher refresh rate. With all of that in mind, 165Hz is going to be perfectly fine for most people playing the latest single-player titles, especially if your focus is on ultra settings, great visual quality, and of course HDR. Getting a lot of AAA games running faster than 120 FPS at 4K is challenging, even with top-tier hardware, and if you like features such as path tracing, you can basically forget about high frame rate gaming. This is where the lower 165Hz refresh rate presents as a great way to access a 4K OLED screen at a lower cost with minimal sacrifices to your gaming experience. You should also be aware that opting for the 165Hz refresh rate affects this panel's dual mode capabilities. With the 240Hz model, the 1080p dual mode runs at up to 480Hz, but with the 165Hz model, the 1080p mode is cut to 330Hz. In both cases, enabling dual mode delivers better motion clarity when gaming at the highest refresh, but the 480Hz mode is even clearer than the 330Hz mode. I don't think this is a huge issue on the UC-WG because the main reason to get this monitor is if you aren't going to be utilizing super high refresh rates. As I said, this is the model designed for single player gamers. Dual mode here is largely a bonus that may go completely unused. At the end of the day, the ASUS ROG Strix XG32 UC-WG is pretty much as expected. It's basically the same as the XG32 UC-WMG we reviewed earlier, just with a reduced 165Hz refresh rate. Performance across key areas is the same or better than the 240Hz model, but at the highest refresh rate, motion clarity isn't as good as the flagship variant. This makes the 240Hz model more versatile for single and multiplayer gamers, whereas the 165Hz model is something I'd mostly recommend for those that love playing AAA single-player titles. At $800 US, I think it's fair value compared to the 240Hz model. You'll save $150 or 15% to drop the refresh rate down to 165Hz with nothing else affected. This is a great entry point to WOLED gaming, especially if you want the panel's features like true black glossy and very solid HDR performance with no panel dimming. Across the entire 32-inch 4K OLED landscape, it's a little harder to justify because 165Hz QD OLEDs start at $650 to $700 US, such as the MSI MAG321UP. I think this glossy WOLED panel is better, but is it better by enough to justify as much as a 23% higher price? Probably not, especially if you're after a bang-for-buck OLED. It's around the same price as some of the cheaper 240Hz QD OLEDs as well, like the MSI 321UPX, which is another way you could go depending on what you want. It's a good monitor all up, but there's also a ton of competition these days, so it pays to look into the options available to you. Anyway, that's it for this shorter than usual review. Hopefully you've got all the information that you need. And if you do want more details on this specific panel, how it performs, comparisons of true black glossy and all that sort of thing, the XG32UC WMG review is for you. So go check that one out. Apart from that, if you want to support Monitors Unboxed and the independent testing that we do, we've got Patreon. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to things like our Discord community, calibrated settings, ICC profiles, and plenty of other good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.